East Hamilton. Well, at the moment, nothing anymore. I just coach. They occasionally bring me back, like in the fall. I was doing engineering design. I've done calculus, computer science, other math classes. Let's see what else I was doing. Oh yeah, lab. So on. Seminar. Can't forget seminar. So you know Chris Hendricks?
Yes.
Oh.
Like a mile.
Okay, so you also live in Eastwood?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, yeah. So he probably, or maybe in both. Back when I was at Arts and Sciences, I was talking a lot. So I may have been teaching math and science, but I also minored in history. So I love history as he does, obviously.
Yes. It was so much fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
So my main thing is coach, track and cross country coach at East Hamilton. But I taught one class in the fall over at East Hamilton, an engineering design class, because they had a teacher leave midsummer and they needed summer. So I taught full time for 10 months, and then I was like, okay, I'm going to scale back. And so that's what I did for 2 years. And then this year, they needed me, and I was like, one class, one semester, and then go back to coaching. So, yeah. And what do you do? That's fantastic. Yes. How many? Oh, awesome. Oh, I have 2 girls. Yeah. And then 16 and 13. Well, one of the great things about
That's good. I'm glad
being a teacher for years is you see all the different flavors not to exclude the parents as well, but the people who actually see every day the craziness I tried to keep mine straightforward. Yeah, but I think, I guess some people, they wanted to get it all out on paper. Well, yes. Yeah. Well, it's all up here. Yes. So I'm trying, for myself, I'm trying to highlight the parts that are actually specific policy amendment recommendations, because there's a lot of other stuff, too. So somebody that I know that used to attend your church regularly, but actually was not very I haven't been in a long time, is Ashley Anytime. Big place, obviously. So she lives right down the myself a note to not walk off. Well, I'm still going to try. I'm sure, but... It'll be how quick I want to get out of here when we're done. Yeah.
Okay, as soon as everybody can get set, we'll get started in just a few minutes. Okay, I think just about everyone is here. Looks like we're missing maybe one or two, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Tonight, we hope to finish up with our recommendations to take to the board. I hope to present them to the school board next Thursday on the 17th, turning my report to them. So tonight, Scott is with us. This is Scott Bennett, our school board attorney. I've been on the phone with him a few times. And he has looked over all the recommendations. He's tried to consolidate them down into one policy to give us something to kind of look at. Just to be clear, we are not actually writing the policy. Scott always helps write the policy. And they go before the school board. We look at it, we tweak it, we adjust it, we add words, we take out words, we add paragraphs, take out paragraphs, edit it, do whatever the board wants to do. It's the board's pleasure to do with it what they will. And then we will Scott, will we vote on this one twice? Since is this just a revision? This will be a total new policy. Okay, so if it's, the reason I'm asking is if there's a revision, you usually just vote on it once. If it's a total new policy, as this will be, you vote on it twice. It has a first reading and a second reading at 2 consecutive school board meetings. Well, they don't have to be consecutive, just at 2 board
Right.
meetings.
And the board always has the authority to go ahead and adopt it right away.
Yeah, so, but anyway, that's the procedure. So this board is, I mean, this committee is actually not writing the policy, we're just making recommendations, because as you can see, this has been a lot of work, and it was a lot more work than we could get to at a school board meeting. So anyway, tonight Scott is gonna be here, and he's going to explain, some of his, reasoning for the policies which he's come up with, and I'm gonna turn it over to Scott.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Thurman. So, I guess before I dive into this, one of there are 2 overarching issues that inform any kind of policy that guides a local board of education in terms of how it reviews materials. There's obviously the overriding concern of the First Amendment. That is an absolute third rail that we cannot violate. We also have the concept that local boards of education are empowered with the, is that better? Okay. Local boards of education are also the organs of government where the community expresses its standards for what education should entail. And it's the mechanism whereby the community speaks its values, whatever those values may be. And in this debate, oftentimes people have asked the question, well, who determines community values? At some level, it's the voters. But the voters then speak those values into the election process, and then the soon-to-be 11 members of the Hamilton County Board of Education reflect those values and guide the development of policy. So we've got those 2 competing considerations, and they don't have to be competing, they can be very complementary. And in this debate, I think there's been some tacit understanding that there are some things that may be difficult to have in schools, but they still add value. There's also some tacit agreement that there are some things that are difficult and they don't need to be at a particular level. And where you draw the line may be some sexually explicit material doesn't need to be in elementary schools. Maybe that's where you draw the line. Maybe you are okay with sexually explicit material, but you have a problem with a text that maybe teaches someone how to build a pipe bomb out of readily available materials from the garage. Maybe that's where you draw the line. I think most people believe that there's a line. The question becomes, where do you draw that line? And I would respectfully suggest that that's the job of the school board, informed by the Constitution, pursuant to a well-established policy. And I say well-established because anytime you make an ad hoc, shoot-from-the-hip decision, very often you're not reacting to the overall tenor of the work. Maybe you're reacting to a hot-button issue, and that can be problematic. And so the Supreme Court has given us some pretty good guidance that whenever you're following a well-thought-out process to review the value of a work, and maybe its difficult parts over against its literary value, if you make a decision that it doesn't conform to community standards, courts are going to give great deference to that decision. But if you're reacting to ideas or policy positions or political statements that you don't like, then that's a different problem. There you're getting into what we call orthodoxy of thought. And that's something that the First Amendment tells us we guard against. We believe in the marketplace of ideas. So there's very definitely a balancing test. So anyway, I'm going to walk through my my edits, and I'm under no illusion. Many of you are going to say, I don't like this. And I'm kind of used to that in my role. And that's okay. Where the rubber will meet the road, quite honestly, is in review committees when there is a case-by-case review of the book in question. what the board is, what I hope to do is guide the board in the development of the policy, so the policy can advise the administration, this is what we expect you to do. Okay, so if you go through 4402 and you go down to line 26, I heard in some of the discussions, and by the way, I apologize, I haven't been able to be here for some of these. I coach a mock trial team, and fortunately they're doing very well, but I've been having to assume those responsibilities when y'all have been meeting. So if you look at line 26, one of the concerns that some committee members had was that you didn't really know how to be guided by particular attention will be paid to addressing the suitability of instructional materials, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I wanted to do was kind of loop that down to some other aspects of the policy so that we had a little bit clearer guidance. And so I have here as set forth below, and then I've changed the word sensitive to offensive to community standards. And the reason being is there are a lot of things that are sensitive that don't meet the constitutional test of something that we need to remove. When you talk about something that's sensitive, that is not constitutionally clear. And you may say, well, offensive to community standards may not be either. But that is at least something that the law recognizes as important. So moving down further, because I've looped this standard into 4403, which I think is where really the rubber is going to meet the road, I've changed the heading here from criteria for selection to criteria for review of material, because I think one of the things that's been brought to the board's attention is that there are actually a lot of works currently in school libraries that, I mean, I don't know if y'all have been at board meetings when these works have been read, but they've been kind of painful to hear. And so the people who've been bringing these works to the board's attention have been making the point, well, if it's painful for you to hear, why is it in a public school library? And there may be a legitimate answer to that question. But the board is not equipped to know that, because the board doesn't sit as a giant book club going through and looking at each of these books, right? There has to be a process. That process is going to be in 4403, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So the preamble to this section is, it's a recognition that some materials, even if they have educational merit, may not be suitable for inclusion in the instructional program of the school or in the library. So it's a recognition there's a balancing test here. That's what it is, there's a balancing test. Not every work is going to be automatically excluded or included. There has to be a balancing test. When initially selecting materials, accepting donations of materials, or reviewing materials for their continued use per 4403, the administration will consider the following criteria. And all of that is basically the same as before, except if you go down to the very bottom, I've tried to give some constitutionally sound guidance to what we talked about above, about particular attention will be paid. And so the language that I've used, and this borrows from the PICO case. It's by no means verbatim, but it reflects the concepts of the Supreme Court case. The extent to which the concept may be considered offensive to community standards on the basis of profane language, graphic depictions of violence or sex, etc. So that's a consideration. So you look at these other things that establish the worth of the work in the preceding bullet points, and then down here, how do you tell if something's offensive? Well, you look at the extent to which the content may be considered offensive to community standards on the basis of profane language, graphic depictions of violence or sex, etc. And the etc. is a tip of the hat to the fact that there's probably something out there that we haven't thought of. But we're not talking about ideas that make us uncomfortable. We're not talking about opposition in the Vietnam War, right? We're talking about something that is of vulgar nature, that is, as the Supreme Court says, kind of flies against what we're trying to do in terms of create model citizens and inculcate values of decency. However, keep reading. So provided otherwise offensive materials may still be used if the relative literary value, as measured in part by the criteria above, outweighs the offensiveness of the content. And so that's a recognition that our ELA folks, our English language arts folks may say, gosh, this is a difficult work. It's hard to read, but there is some value to it. And what resonated with me, and Ms. Thurman, you can remember the name of the book, I can't, but it was the book that Joe Smith talked about.
Far from the Tree.
Far from the Tree. So he was describing how it was a really, really hard book for him to read. It really bothered him. But he also said, this is a great book. It really resonated with him. And so there's a recognition that sometimes difficult books still have good value. And so what we have to do as a public education system is have a process where it's vetted and that is weighed. But keep reading. Further provided that outweighs the offensiveness of the content, the board gets to figure that one out. I said keep reading, I lied, it's further down. We'll keep reading, but we'll get to it in just a second. So again, there's a balancing test that we have to apply, and it's not something that we can apply from the hip. There really does have to be a committee to assess the relative worth of the book. And I say book, obviously you all understand what I mean. In this day and age, it could be any kind of material, right? Almost any kind of literary material that's in this category. All right, so library, collection, and optional materials. I made a note about donated materials, that those should be vetted too. Look at the very, very end. In the event the administration or the board determines that a work is offensive but nevertheless offers literary value, then steps will be taken to advise parents or guardians when their students have access to any such material. And that's just sort of like a parental advisory. So it's not that some of these works come out. And by the way, I'm not sold on any of this language, and I'm gonna ask Jamie and his team maybe to look at this and offer some comment on whether it makes sense to the administration before we actually kick it to the board. But the recognition here is there may be a work that's difficult, it's hard, but it still carries value, and maybe it does offer something useful to our students in balance. So what do? The recognition is that parents have a right to know, right? Because parents still are the ones who are in charge of raising their kids. The fact that the students are here in our system for most of the week doesn't mean that we supplant parents. So it's a recognition, there's a balance coupled with parents have a right to know. And there must be a way that we could advise parents either through Power School or something, or maybe I don't know. This is where my role as a lawyer ends, because I don't really know the operations here, but I'm sure there's something that can be done. Rhonda, do you want to go into 443 now, or do you want to stop and comment on this?
Yeah, the reason that he went ahead, because he's going to work on hand in glove. He couldn't do one without the other. And you have made some changes to this one by putting the criteria in there. So I think, why don't you just go on and then finish up, or do you want to ask anybody that has any problem with this? You want to do that first?
It's your committee.
Okay. Well, let's ask if anyone has any comments about this one policy before we move on. Okay.
I am still wondering which reading material we're looking at, because we've gotten different charges. And at first I thought it was just library books. Then we've mentioned other things, and then you brought in ELA pieces, so that's now curriculum, and that seems to have a different policy built around it. So what exactly are we charged with looking at?
So I can't answer the question what this committee wants to assume as its charge. My role is to help the board understand and develop policy. One of my roles is to help the board understand and develop policy. And to address some of the concerns that I felt that both this committee has had, but also the board has had, but also some of the parents who have spoken to the board, my thought was, fundamentally, we look at 4403, because 4403 is the vehicle whereby we reconsider instructional materials and textbooks, and that's a very broad loop. 4402, if I'm going to edit 4403, then I need to take a look at 4402 as well, because if you look at line 30, it's 33, the criteria, that right there, the reason I came back to 4402, honestly, is because I've looked at policies from literally around the country in terms of what are some of the considerations that review committees often look at. And I think this is a really well-developed set of criteria, and maybe doesn't really guide the administration as clearly about what is offensive, and it doesn't really inform how you balance. But if you're trying to assess literary merit, these bullet points, by the way, I have to apologize for my formatting. I'm not a particularly effective legal secretary. So I apologize for the formatting here. But, rather than copying everything from 4402 and putting it into 4403, I thought it'd be more efficient to change 4402 as part of my edits to 443, if that makes some sense. And so while here, I just tweaked this policy as well. I hope that makes some sense. You asked me what time it was, and I kind of told you how I built a clock.
We didn't get into ELA. He just brought that into.
That was a for
because,
instance.
That was a for instance. We're not doing ELA.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you look at 4403, the assumption here is that whoever, well, you know what, take that back. So I told you that I've spent so much time looking at so many different policies. One of the things that was rattling around in my head is you might want to talk to an ELA specialist about the relative value of a work, but I haven't changed that to 4403 because I thought it was going a little too far. That's an idea up here that hasn't made it to paper. I apologize.
And then have you read the librarian handbook?
I've read the Librarian Bill of Rights.
Okay. I was wondering, because you mentioned a committee would determine if a piece of literature has enough merit, educational value to merit the language or whatever offensive material it might contain. But the librarians already have that in play
So,
by the Tennessee by multiple professional standards. So I wonder why we would add another committee when they're already doing that, and to such a high level of standards that's
well,
common across the country.
so I'm going to disagree a little bit with what you said, not because they're not working to a high set of standards, but rather because of the Library Bill of Rights. Their ethical considerations are different from what a local board of educations might be. Under the Library Bill of Rights, they actually have an ethical obligation to make more materials available to students than the Hamilton County Board of Education might think is appropriate. For instance, if you look at Article 5 of the Library Bill of Rights, it speaks to information should not be deprived of students on the basis of their age. Well, if you follow that to its logical conclusion, then why not make The Handmaid's Tale available to elementary students? Likewise, if you look at Article 7 of the Library Bill of Rights, it talks about people who use the library are entitled to confidentiality regardless of all of these considerations. And I think as a matter of public policy, the Board of Education would respectfully disagree, while at the same time recognizing ethical obligations that librarians have. I think they would take, and I can't speak for the board, I don't presume to, but I think that the board would say, we respect your professional obligations here, but as the elected representatives of Hamilton County, we have a role in deciding what's appropriate as well.
So I have a question about that.
Sure.
Because they're not just using just the Librarian Bill of Rights. They have other things in place laid out in the handbook. and they do take consideration into age appropriate, and they list the resources, the credited resources by which they choose. And also librarians also have different student bodies, so some might have a K through 12 library, some might have just a high school library, some might have a middle school, high school library, so they have to take that into consideration, and it's all laid out in the handbook, and it's not just, they're not just using the Bill of Rights.
Right, and I understand that. My point isn't to try to pigeonhole what I know is a complicated decision-making process for librarians. My point is to recognize that fundamentally it's the role of the Board of Education to make these decisions. Now, they need to be informed decisions, and I think the librarians play a role in giving the board good information. But it's not simply that. It's not just that. And so to that point, I think the review committee of 4403 can look a little bit different. That's one area that I haven't changed, because in part I wanted to talk with the administration about the administrative procedures they use in implementing 4403.
May I say something about the Librarians Bill of Rights? I think we're doing this thing backwards. We're taking the Library's Bill of Rights and we're trying to make our policy to fit that. That's not the way this thing works. The Librarian's Handbook should take our policy and make their handbook after our policy. Because the ALA is really nothing more than a union for librarians. Just like the HCEA, the NEA is a union for teachers. That's what the ALA is. They have members. They advocate for their members. They write all of their guidelines. They implement their guidelines in libraries. They tell you to go against anyone that questions any of the rules that they made. And then they say, we have a legal arm that will come and represent you legally if somebody goes against the policies that we wrote, or against the guidelines that we wrote for libraries. It's kind of like they're just in a circle, and the school board's supposed to march to their drum, and I don't appreciate that. I mean, it takes a lot of work to get on the school board. It's hard to get elected. You have to go through this process. The people elect us. They didn't elect this group, this unknown group anymore. We don't quote the HCEA and stuff when we do our other policies. I think we have in the past, but we've taken all of that out because they are not elected, they're not appointed, and they're not accountable. The school board is. So I'm tired of hearing that, look at the Librarian's Handbook. No, the Librarian's Handbook needs to look at our policy. That's why we spend all this time doing that. Because I've spent a lot of time this past week looking at the ALA, the TLA, all of these, the AALA, I think is the other one. And they're all affiliates of each other. So they all just write rules to complement each other. And then, like I say, then they send out these letters that say, don't let anyone censor anything in your library, and if you do, we have a legal counsel that's going to come after them. Okay, well, I'll let you go right ahead.
The reconsideration policy that's in the Librarian Handbook is exactly the board policy.
Yeah,
I know the board policy took it. That's just it. The ALA pretty much wrote the board policy on that.
And let me
They
say-
did.
And I don't necessarily.
Because it's the same, pretty much, am I right? It's the same pretty much across
I think the Librarian
everywhere.
Handbook isn't just ALA.
Well, no, it's not, but
And
I'm
it
saying.
actually
no, no.
referenced in multiple places, it
I
referenced board policy, so I don't see it as backwards. I actually see them reading the board policy and building
But like I
the
say, but
handbook.
they build a lot of their stuff on the ALA, but I'm not gonna get sidetracked on that. David, go
Okay.
ahead.
So, Mr. Bennett, I have what is probably a 2 or 3 part question, but I'll start with the first part, which may mean that I don't need to ask some of the rest. So I was wondering first if you could explain to me a little bit more your edit for line 33 in Board Policy 402. You changed it from criteria of selection to criteria for review of material. Could you talk a little bit more about what you're getting at there, why you chose to remove the word selection and add those 3 words?
Yes, sir. As I was explaining earlier in response to the lady, we need to have a criteria for how we review material under 4403. There really isn't anything spelled out in 4403 to guide the committee in terms of how to weigh these competing considerations. And in my opinion, if the committee were to recommend the removal of a particular book and it didn't have criteria spelled out that it was following, I think that would be constitutionally infirm. We need to provide guidance from the board before something is removed. So that was the reason that I changed this language from criteria for selection to criteria for review. The two policies inform one another.
So part two, and this is the part where I'm going to propose a flaw in the change, and you will hopefully explain to me why it's not a flaw.
Okay. It may be.
So the way I read that part of the policy before, it was setting a bar. You must hit some of these criteria in order to be selected. And by removing the word selection and making it review of material, and then adding to that on the next page, the item 8, the whole extent to which the content may considered offensive. Before, all those criteria were positive things, bars you have to hit to be selected. And I'm just reading this obviously tonight for the first time, but at first blush, it seems perhaps unintentionally to water everything down, because now that extra one is not a positive bar to hit. It's dealing, like you said, tying into that whole separate review thing. And because we've removed selection from the start, it seems to me to water down a little bit the clarity before that this is the minimum standard to select. Because like you said, we are not curating a public library. We have a variety of concerns that you mentioned. So please explain to me
Sure.
where I may be mistaken about
Well,
that.
I don't know
flaw.
that you are. I think that's a valid point. And so I don't have a problem with criteria for selection or review of material, because quite frankly, depending upon what stage you are in the process, you're either selecting material to add or you're reviewing material for further consideration. I think that's a well-taken observation, and I'm going to mark that and doodle on it for later. As far as the last point, I'm not completely sure I understand I understand that other things are positive and this is negative. It's intended to be a consideration. So it may be that you have a work that has educational purpose. It contributes to the subject matter, et cetera, et cetera. My concern about this particular policy as it currently exists is that there is no toehold for someone reviewing a work to balance the merit of the work against how difficult it might be. And so I believe the board needed to give the board needed to be able to speak to the committee, some criteria for how you balance a work that might be difficult. I take no pride in authorship. There's nothing here that is inspired. So if you have some suggestions for some different language, by all means, send it to me during the week, and I'll be happy to think about it and include it.
Okay, so before then, thank you for that. And so before my final part, I will just add now that offhand, I think maybe that bullet should not be, if we tighten that back up to criteria for selection, maybe that bullet, I think it's covering, like you said, it ties back to the review process, it ties back to state law, what it talks about for obscenity and harmful to minors. Maybe it shouldn't be one of the bullets, though. Maybe it should be just its own language explaining this is part of what needs to be in the administration's process, like some of the other paragraphs that aren't there.
And it's funny that you said that. I actually considered having that as a separate paragraph. Notwithstanding the above, these are some criteria. My concern about having it as a separate paragraph, honestly, was that if it was a separate paragraph, my thought was that it would swallow everything that came above rather than being a consideration. So it's interesting. I was concerned that it would overemphasize it by it becoming a separate paragraph, but I'm not opposed to that.
Okay.
I'll make that edit and I'll give some thought to it.
Okay, and I could see that point of view. You know, I'm coming from my point of view that if you happened to look through this packet, I know there's a lot in here, but one of the things that I've been concerned about is ensuring, as you mentioned and others have mentioned, that balance at appropriate levels of cognitive development, age appropriateness. So I would, I guess in my mind, want that balancing of value and offensiveness potentially and difficulty to be very explicitly considered for the different levels rather than being tucked into a bullet point. So that's my point of view.
Your point's well taken, and I will, what I may do is I may run an edit with that and just see what it looks like and show it to some folks. It is interesting, my goal was for it not to overemphasize and swallow everything that came before it, but I also understand what you're saying.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And so my final part is there's, when you use the word as part of then that paragraph being added under criteria for selection or review of material, whichever way that ends up, you have the word accepting donations of materials. So selecting materials, accepting donations, reviewing materials. I'm not sure how to phrase this question without just telling you what I wanted. So I guess I'd just say that it seems to me we could have a better word than accepting, something like
Receiving?
Receiving, it's still like you're not clearly making a judgment. Something like approving is the word that I would say, approving donations of materials. Because accepting in my mind leaves in, and maybe I'm being too picky, a little bit of a hole there that, well, we considered it while accepting it, but it didn't say that we don't accept it. So again, I may be nitpicking there, but I would think approving might be better. So I guess the question out of that then is, do you see anything wrong with changing it to approving?
None whatsoever.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Angela.
I have about 4, maybe 5 things. One he kind of touched on. As far as the criteria for selection, by changing that to review, I kind of feel like it diminishes the selection process by taking that word out. If we were to keep that in there, could we not put for selection or reconsideration? And that would apply to both, because I was thinking that 4.402 is a selection of materials. So not necessarily a review or reconsideration should be in this part of the policy. That would be under 4.403. So if we're going to apply that as part of the criteria for selection, we need to, that terminology I hope would stay in there so that we don't lose that as selection process. Secondly, under the second page, line 8, in line with the idea that you were going along with First Amendment rights, keeping similar to Miller test type line items, is there a way to add as a whole in there with that terminology kind of in line with the First Amendment criteria for how they review obscene material, so that we're judging a book on its whole, and that's not diluted in that language. I'm not sure how we would word that any other way to meet that request.
I'll give some
Because
thought to
it's like
that.
you need to do a book report on something before you kind of make that judgment.
Yeah.
So how we kind of make sure that that says, we're making sure that it's otherwise offensive as a whole versus community standard as a whole. So that stays kind of true to, I guess, if it went further up legally, it would kind of be in line with other areas.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I'll give some thought to that. One of the things that I try to do when I'm developing a policy is I try to avoid legalese, believe it or not. I mean, Rhonda would laugh at that. But I debated whether to use that language as a whole, because I don't know I don't know that someone's gonna understand when there's an offensive part versus what that does to the work as a whole. And I'll give you a very specific example. The Mouse book up in McMinn County. the work as a whole, very powerful. But there were some very specific objections to the image of suicide, some very serious concerns, because fundamentally, this wasn't a book about the Holocaust. It was an 8th grade ELA book. And there was some concern about that particular image with some particular,
I'm familiar.
and so I struggle with when, as a whole, as a constitutional standard, is something that that creates more confusion than clarity. I'll give some thought to that, because honestly, I had that thought, and the fact that a committee member has raised that question, I think maybe means I need to rethink about it. I need to rethink it.
Yeah, 'cause I felt like it was kind of like in line with, like the Roth case and then Miller, and it's kind of been in that terminology for the Supreme Court that if this went further, that kind of is the standard that's already set. So that was my thought process on that.
Well, yes, but now you're thinking about a somewhat different standard for the Supreme Court than than the suitability of a particular work for students in a school library. That's the PICO standard, and the PICO standard is a little bit different from your point's well taken.
And I'll look that up, I'm curious
Yeah,
as well.
your point's well taken, and it's something that I've been kind of struggling with. I'll think about it.
Okay. The next question I had when we talked about donated materials was kind of to David's point. And I guess when we put that line in there, or change how things enter or not, I'm curious of, I guess, the district's part or role in that, and how that plans to play out as far as who is responsible for following that criteria within the district or public as to what that is, because I feel like there are a lot of educators and a lot of people who would be really curious to how that process is of at the door, I guess, at that line. Like when you walk in, who's responsible for meeting that criteria, because it's not librarians or it's not people paid by Hamilton County. There are lots and lots of organizations who participate as community partners. And so who would be the responsible party for that? Would we, as an organization, I'm volunteer with an organization, I'm sure you know, that has donated books to our school. So would it be the literary experts we consulted? Would it be people within the district that we consulted for these lists? Would it be the specific teachers that we consulted for the list? Like trying to figure out if we put that this wouldn't be there, are we playing into the operational value of that, or where does that go? Because you're just saying, nope, we can't take this unless it meets this criteria. Does that mean you just don't take anything at this point? Because right there, if there's not a criteria, responsible party set, how does that happen?
Well, if I understood your question correctly, I think you're asking whose responsibility is it at the school level to vet the suitability of books that are being donated?
Yes, that.
Well, okay. So I think the answer would be that's an administrative decision. It's either the principal or the librarian. But I mean, it's fundamentally, it's the principal because he runs the school.
Okay. I mean, that's, as long as that's like the standard.
There's somebody in charge.
Yeah, the standard of whose path that would go
That-
through.
that the
Okay.
district-
And that's already in the board
Is it-
policy.
Yeah, I was
It-
thinking that was in there, but
Whether it's the principal or the librarian or the chair of the English department,
Sure.
somebody is responsible for implementing board policy. So.
sure. I get, okay.
Okay.
And then the last thing I had was in relation to Rhonda's comments about the ALA and them being a lobbyist organization. And
No, I didn't
how-
say that. I said they were a union. I
Or
didn't say, I never
union,
used the
okay.
word lobbyist, no.
So they were affiliated.
But
in-
they are, but
outside
that's okay.
affiliation. So when we're taking that into consideration, I have a strong issue with the fact that our committee today is made up with at least 5 people, all from one politically partisan affiliated group.
That has nothing to do with
Yes,
this.
it does. That is
Well,
rep-
there may be 6 or
that is
7 or 10.
misappropriated
That's
representation.
absolutely,
Ma'am,
everybody
can I please
everybody
finish?
has one
She's
voice. Ma'am, I am not deaf. I hear her speaking.
But can I finish my thought? I
Yes,
mean,
go ahead.
I do think there are concerns amongst our community, not just myself, that there are a misappropriated representation on our committee. At least one noted, not diverse, one noted that we have a politically affiliated partisan group that has a mission to remove kids from public education on a large part of this committee. So as we take into consideration of materials, I think that that might be something that is,
Conflict of interest.
yes, a conflict in our process. So I did want that noted, as we talk about professional national organizations maybe not being the creditable resource that we think. We might need to point our focus inward and know exactly what resource we are as well.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank
Go ahead, Rebecca.
I did have one question, but now I have one comment and one question. We have
Okay.
a school board member who wants to dismantle the school system, so publicly said that. My only question is, there, here on the second page on line 12, it says library collection. So I was wondering, and Meg touched on this, what the definition of library collection is in the context of line 10 where it says school, library, and classroom. Can we add the word library to classroom, or could we just define library collection? Is that, I don't know, is that possible?
I see your question, your observation, Ms. Day. So maybe what I need to do is add to line 12, no donated material will be entered into the library or classroom collections.
Well, I would put available collections or something, because they can get it from the classroom, from some group that comes in. There's more ways that they can get the books. I wouldn't just limit it to the library.
Read 20, lots of organizations.
The internet,
in the schools.
their Chromebooks.
Very strong question. That there's lots of people, but no matter where they come from, they're gonna have to meet the same.
Well, and the observation about the internet, there's a limit to what we can filter on the internet, even on our web. I think I understand your point. Got it.
I had a couple of questions. The committee that you referenced.
Were you finished, Rebecca?
Oh,
Okay, go
okay.
ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, the committee that you referenced, will it be spelled out in the policy, like who it's gonna be made up of, who will appoint or decide who's on the committee, what the makeup of it will be? And will it be like at a school level committee, or will it be at the district level? I'm just curious about those things.
Well, the way it exists right now is spelled out in 4403. And, did you want to comment on that? About how that's-
Probably before we go to 403, let me make one observation about 402 that I had spoken with Scott about, and I told him I would bring it up. I still am not comfortable with line 13 on the second page, or it actually starts on line about 12, I guess. It says, however, there may be sensitive content contained in these books that was not previously reviewed by school personnel. I don't think there should be any books there that's not previously reviewed by school personnel, because that just gives a big old gaping hole there for somebody, maybe there to be a book that is very questionable, and they'll say, well, I'm sorry, but this is one of those books that was not previously reviewed, and we said that there were gonna be books that were not previously reviewed. I don't like that whole sentence myself. If it says that every book that comes in has to be vetted, I don't know how we can have books that are not previously reviewed.
I understand your concern. First of all, that language is already there
Yeah,
in
right, it's
the
from the old
policy.
right.
But it's a recognition to the fact that librarians have a lot to do. And
So do parents.
I hear what you're saying, and I'm not saying that you're wrong. What I'm saying is, as a practical matter, if we apply the same issue to school principals, you need to check every single one of your ceiling tiles. Sometimes it's easier.
And we
to
do get sued for that, by the way.
I'm very well aware of that. But sometimes it's easier to fix the one that falls in, and then you replace them one at a time. There is a mechanism under the policy where a parent or a student can raise an issue, and so it's dealt with on a case-by-case basis. The board can require a periodic review of existing materials. I just don't know how much time it's gonna take,
Can I-
or how, what that would look like.
And that says by school personnel, right? So the librarians are also using reviews, so these books are being looked at by reviews, sites, other type things. So it's not, it just means the school personnel personally have not reviewed it, right? They're
Right.
using other credible sources for review purposes.
Could I ask my second part, though? Does this policy allow for, or provide for revisiting a book or a particular set of books, like, if it wins a particular award, or, we realize that we need it for AP classes, or just to be a well-rounded citizen when we get to college? Is a book that's going through this process and put out of the schools, is there an opportunity for it to be revisited and reconsidered?
So, to your first question about AP, the 4402, I think actually recognizes that AP and IB works are frequently dictated by outside regulatory groups. And so, if you're gonna take AP, you're gonna take IB, then there are certain books you're going to read. And it's understood that there's not gonna be a lot of wiggle room where the school administration can give you a pass on some book that you may find uncomfortable. To your second point about is there a specific opportunity to reconsider, it's not spelled out in the policy, but I think that's necessarily implied, because when you're talking about changing, well, frankly, evolving community standards. So maybe a book is deemed inappropriate 5 years ago, but because of different current events, maybe because of, I'm thinking back in time, I read some really rough things in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was looking at going into the Foreign Service, studying the Soviet Union. I'm now dusting off that book collection. I'm not saying that we wait 40 years to review something. Gosh, I'm just dating myself. But your point's well taken. Is there an opportunity to review something? Yeah, I think so. I think you go through the criteria that is in 442, and maybe your calculus changes. So. Maybe suddenly the contribution of the subject matter to the curriculum, to the interest of students, maybe that changes in view of changing circumstances. Timeliness or permanence of the content, maybe that changes. I think in that scenario, I think a librarian or an ELA teacher or an ELA coach would be wise to maybe go back to whatever body had made the decision. Maybe it was the school level review committee, or maybe it was the board, and make the case, under the circumstances, we'd like to have this reconsidered. I think that should be worked into the administrative procedures, which we're kind of writing in midair. So I think that's a great point.
So, was there someone else? Wait, no. Okay. So I don't know if this is more appropriate for the general discussion or the questions for board attorney portion, but seeing that I believe it ties into what Ms. Thurman and Mr. Bennett just raised is I will point out, definitely the horse has been beaten to death, but in my suggestions in the packet, so directly related to what Ms. Thurman said, where there's still this language about, well, there may be things in there that haven't been reviewed, and then Mr. Bennett said, well, maybe some people would notice in that case and bring it back. So the question out of this is, so I had some language in here that the details would be up to the administration, but policy language specifying a prompt determination, in my case, I put by school administrator, ELA chair, and a librarian or teacher, as to whether the material may be harmful to minors. And this was if it's there and it has not been reviewed. As Ms. Thurman raised, that there's this language in there that things may have not been reviewed. And that just seems to chain backwards to me to the other suggestion that I had made, which is not in Mr. Bennett's version, which is we need some explicit language saying we need documentation of how this whole process happened. We know for the past it's not currently there, and maybe it will be added over time, but for things that it isn't, I feel like, to the points that Ms. Thurman and Mr. Bennett said, this would help that. So I guess the question out of that, if I could, I guess, direct that to Mr. Bennett, is there a reason of policy that it would be a bad idea to specify in policy that there needs to be documentation, not getting too much into the weeds of exactly what it is, but that there needs to be? And then related to that, is it a problem to have language saying this is what you do for something that doesn't have policy? Because we just acknowledged there's going to be things that don't have documentation and policy.
So I'm not sure I understood the second half
Yeah.
of that question. So let me deal with the first
Sure.
and maybe illuminate the
Yeah.
second. So if you look forward to 4403, and in particular, new line 30, of course, the board has the ultimate decision on whether something is or isn't appropriate. And so what I've baked into this is the board has the discretion to sustain the review committee on the record or to grant a new hearing. And what I intend by that, and then this is again an administrative procedure, is the review committee needs to have minutes. It's conducting a hearing, and there are procedures that the administration follows when we are conducting hearings of all sorts, whether it's a disciplinary review, whether it's involving an employee. There's a process that we follow internally for these hearings. And so my way of thinking is it will look a lot like that. There will be a record developed from, okay, what is the complaint? Okay, let's be sure we understand the complaint. Okay, so what says the rest of the team? And then there's a discussion and then a decision. So my thought here is that if someone appeals to the board,
Scott, hold on. Were you talking about on the front end, though? You're talking about accountability on the front end before it gets there. He was wanting somebody to
Yeah.
sign off on it, somebody to go back to,
It's-
that on the
I
front
think
end.
I apologize.
Oh,
for
well,
misunderstanding the question.
it's a little bit of A and a little bit of B, because you can't have language, you don't need language to fix when something wasn't reviewed and documented if you don't have language requiring documentation. So the two-part concern for me, well, one is going forward, are we documenting to make sure that the process is really happening so we can go back and look? But then part two is, it seems to me we have and we still have some jeopardy here for the system, that we're acknowledging there are things that have not been reviewed directly, were not reviewed. And then we say, well, there's this whole process you need to go through, which very clearly is a lengthy process. So the question becomes, is it advisable? I would say it's advisable, but is it unusual to have some kind of emergency prompt process for a quick judgment when you don't have that documentation?
So,
Yeah.
so I think I'm following with you.
Okay.
So initially, there's no liability for having a book in the library that hasn't been reviewed.
Okay.
It's just a book. It doesn't reach out and grab you and make you read it. So you're not going to be assaulted by a book, I guess, unless if another student does it. So there's no liability for having an inert book sitting on the shelf and it's just there. So the liability piece doesn't concern me. What I'm concerned about is if we have something that is there, it's been there for a while, and now we're saying it doesn't need to be there, we're now changing the status quo. And so we need to have some documentation for why we're changing that status quo. I think the policy does a good job with that. And again, our administrative procedures are gonna sharpen that point. I don't have those. we don't typically, the board doesn't typically review administrative procedures because it's sort of like a how-to manual for how the administration implements a particular policy. Let me go back to, I'm glad you clarified that, Rhonda, because I completely missed it. To your point about the selection of materials, my anticipation would be that whoever is vetting this at the school level, they're going through the process. And it may be an email. Principal Smith, I'd like to get some of these books for the library. Here's their cost. Here are some considerations. Da 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 da. Please see the attached. That's sufficient documentation on the front end to show that someone has done their due diligence. At least in my book, it is. I mean, Jamie may have a different take. I think that satisfies our due diligence. I think if you're going to remove it, you got to dig a little bit deeper. I think I've covered your questions.
I think so. I just have one clarification I want to get there because you mentioned liability. I've been trying so far to avoid hypothetical cases, but in this case, I don't know another way to ask it is, so let's say we have a child with some mental health issues, and maybe they've gone and seen treatment, and then they've been cleared to go back to school. But I can speak from experience, it's always a very careful line with these kids. Things that you might not expect can cause them to regress. And let's say there's a book on the shelf which unexpectedly in there depicts some sort of violent or suicidal behavior, and then the kid acts out. So we're not liable for that as a system. If we knew that, if we've acknowledged that there may be stuff in there no one's reviewed, it turns out this book is sitting in a middle school library, and probably wasn't appropriate for middle school, but nobody caught it, and then a student who has mental health issues regresses due to having picked that up and hurts themselves or others. We're not liable as a system for that.
I would have a hard time connecting those dots to liability. The standard for liability for negligence in the state of Tennessee is you knew or should have known of certain facts that gave rise to a duty to act. You negligently failed to act, and the resulting injury is the result of your failure to act. That's garden variety negligence.
Okay.
There are a lot of, in your hypothetical, there are a lot of predicates that someone would have to jump over, including knowing that the book is in the library. Well, I didn't know, and the exercise of due care, I wouldn't. There's no reason I would have known, because I've got librarians in the room. There's a dear lady from Nolan Elementary. Approximately how many?
Roughly 9,000 books on average.
At any given school?
About on average.
Okay, so if we assume that that's correct, I was going to ask.
18,000, you said?
It's an average.
So yeah, my children
9,000.
My children went to Nolan, so that's the one that I'm is it 9,000 more or less? 18,000 at Nolan. Wow. Okay. So I would suggest that that to expect the librarian at Nolan to know what her predecessors going back 10 years or more may have put in the library is an unreasonable ask. But let's change that. Let's change
Well,
that.
if I could interject though, so you actually, I expected that, so now my second part of the question is, so now let's say somebody has brought up this book has something that on the face of it is clearly inappropriate, and so we've got this long process, but the book, I believe the process says the book stays on the shelf. So then, now we know, but we said the book stays on the shelf, and then something happens. And perhaps it's been brought up because it's in the news, and now somebody goes out and seeks it out, and they act out because of that. Are we liable at that point?
Even there, I think that's too tenuous a connection. There's another principle that we have in negligence law called proximate cause, and so it's got to be not just the cause in fact, but it's got to be the legal cause. And what you would have to connect there is that the school officials actually knew that this child with his proclivities was somehow endangered by this particular book, and you knew that he was going to gravitate toward that book. In the universe, is that a series of possibilities? Yes. But I would frankly hope that if we knew that we had a child with those tendencies, we would already have a different safety net around that kid, so that the last thing we're worried about is the book in the library. I understand the question, and, you know, being an attorney, I live in the world of what ifs. You know, think about it, no one ever calls us with good news, it's always something bad happens. So I live in the world of what ifs. Except Rhonda. Rhonda's
Yeah,
always-
could you talk a little bit more about that safety net? Because, you know, I know that when kids are returned to school, you have a lot of very careful restrictions on making sure you do not discriminate against that child due to past mental health issues. So how would that safety net work when, on the one hand, you're trying to include them and get them back to normalcy? But I mean, are you supposed to, as a teacher, I'm thinking as a teacher here, be like when you've got this book on the shelf that's controversial, be like, you know, and everybody's there, and be like, Bob, you stay by me and keep an eye on him so he doesn't touch this book.
Whatever
And
you
what
do,
if he
don't
does
do that
touch
book.
this book?
Yeah,
So what does that safety net look like?
So honestly, I think we're going kind of far afield. Not knowing the specific kid and not knowing what we're talking about, I don't know that I can go into too many hypotheticals. But if we have a child who, I don't know, it's difficult for me to answer that question. It's probably the best way I can say it, is that not knowing a specific kid and not knowing what his 504 plan would look like, I'm a little uncomfortable kind of pulling something out of thin air. And I don't know that it's the work of this committee or even the board to figure out what that looks like. My thought would be, if I'm talking to the 504 coordinator and someone advocating on behalf of that child, my thought is, as part of our due diligence, I'm going to want to know what this kid's triggers are, and then we're going to work to manage those triggers. And my concern would be we were going to have 14 or 15 other things before we get to the library. Not that there couldn't be a trigger there. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that what you're describing is a very complex landscape, and it's a little difficult for me to pick out one part of it in a vacuum.
And I agree, it's complex, which is, at the risk of pontificating for just a moment, it's puzzling to me why we wouldn't have an emergency escape valve rather than just mandating the book stays on the shelf, when it may be something where it's, when the professionals at the school look at it, to be clear, they're like, this has got to go. And right now, their hands are tied. If it turns out that, as we've admitted in the policy,
Okay.
that there's
Now,
stuff.
Scott, that's
Yeah.
in the request for reconsideration, correct?
Mhm.
Okay, we are looking at redoing the request for reconsideration.
Okay.
That's also on the table, that Scott has also been looking at different ones from all around, and we're
Right.
not gonna get into that right now, but been looking at one, but I have a problem with that, it stays on the shelf. That was one of the questions that I had, but we are looking to redo the request for reconsideration as well. So we'll certainly, when that comes about, then that's where that is.
And the last thing that I'll say, and I'll be careful how I say this. We're not going to decide the content of a library on the basis of one child. We're going to decide the content of the library or the curriculum or something else based upon educational standards. The curriculum's driven by the state standards. So, I mean, really, if we're removing something from the library, it's going to have to hit criteria about being offensive. What you're talking about is you have a piece of material that maybe doesn't get removed from the library because it doesn't meet our standards of offensiveness, but it's a trigger for a particular child. I don't know that we remove a book. I don't know that we give a child's health condition a veto over what's in the library. But I hesitate to say that that's the conclusion. Because again, I'm struggling with how we balance the First Amendment considerations.
I guess I should be clear, two parts to what you said is, one is, I know, I think at least partially in the current policy for reconsideration, and I would assume going forward, we have the language about harmful to minors, which comes from the state language, which includes offensive, but also it's broader than that, if I recall, the harmful to minors standard. And then part two, just to clarify, I'm not talking about a book that may just be harmful to one kid, but that's the most serious case. We're talking about, hopefully, the books that upon either short or long review, eventually we will be like, this was inappropriate to be at this age level, at this school. And so that's what I'm worried about, is then the long process will also determine it wasn't appropriate for that age level, but then in the short term, we have this condition that we have to.
So we could be sensitive to the rest of the committee members' time and also the work that we still need to do with other policy. Let me commit to this with you. Let me read carefully the comments that you have offered in the packet. And maybe you and I can connect so that I can be sure that I understand what it is you're concerned about. So that
Okay.
because I want to do justice to your concerns, and I feel like I don't understand them well enough to do that right now.
Sure.
Okay. All right, down there on the end, she had her hand up a minute ago. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. A couple of comments. I will just, sorry. I'll reiterate some of what Angela pointed out earlier, just kind of to put on the record. And this is in 4.402 on the last page. The new language that you added, I think it would be helpful if we added the word contemporary before community standards, especially in light of what you were talking about, that this may evolve over time, that maybe something that was inappropriate 10 years ago or offensive to community standards in light of current events would no longer be, you know.
That's at line 8?
That would be, yeah, the new line 8. Just adding the word contemporary. And then I would just kind of second Angela's comment about taking the work as a whole. I'm not exactly sure where to fit that in. This is, we're just getting this.
I
these
know where I
revisions
would.
tonight.
I know where I would put
Yeah,
that.
I just would encourage you, I'd kind of add my voice to that column.
Yeah, I know where to put that if I include it. My concern, well,
We already hit it, I understand.
yeah, there's when you're looking at something for inclusion in a school library, it's a different calculus than whether the work as a whole is obscene.
No, I
So
understand.
when you're looking at the
But-
Miller standard, you are looking at the work as a whole, and I think that's a valuable admonition. But you can have hot spots in a particular work that tips the balance. I hear what you're saying, and
I would just add my voice
I
as a
will
member of the
commit.
community that I don't think a single hotspot within a book should override its inclusion in any collection.
I understand what you're saying, and I will commit to looking at that because
I appreciate it.
I think it's valuable thought, and I hope that you.
I don't
can-
think it's unworkable, I don't think it's too confusing.
And I hope it's come across that I'm really struggling with trying to strike the right balance, because there's a right balance, and what someone finds objectionable in this season, 2 years from now, it may be very, very, very different.
You can always
So-
rewrite the policy.
So to follow on that point, Mr.
Community
Bennett,
standards will change.
Sure.
just to follow on that point, I think Mr. McKissick brought up the idea of bringing up a book that was maybe rejected previously for reconsideration. There's two different places, both in 4.402 and 4.403, that says the judgment of the board shall be final. So that, to me, if I were a librarian or if I were a principal, I would say, this book was rejected, like that door is closed. So I would just, if we are going to consider that books could be brought back up for reconsideration, I think that needs to be written into the policy in a clearer way.
I'll give that some thought.
Yeah, and maybe it's an additional sentence, maybe it's somewhere else, but
Yeah, I
this
think
to
that-
me looks like a very closed door.
Well, and
It is for that minute.
it is for that
It
minute.
is for then. I
And-
mean,
and
you
one
can
of
always
the things
re-vote
that-
on it, but.
And one of the things that we say all the time is that one board can't bind the next. So, that's
So maybe
why-
that's the,
Well, and I guess because we live there, we know that, but My thought is that the best place to do that is probably in the administrative procedures, because you're right. If the board has said that we don't think this is appropriate, I think that does carry some weight. And so I think if a librarian wants it to be reconsidered, or if a principal wants it to be reconsidered, I think that there needs to be,
A request for reconsideration for the librarians possibly, or.
there's.
So are you saying you're considering a whole new policy?
No,
Not-
no.
Not 4.403?
Administrative procedures.
No, I understand
So
that.
my thought is that there's a mechanism in place. Anytime the director of schools says, I'd like the board to rethink something, that happens with some regularity. So I hear what you're saying. It sounds final.
Yeah.
In the world where we live in, it doesn't feel that way to me.
Okay.
But
Well, this policy is also written for the community to understand how to complain about books, so I think it needs to be written in a way that both you and the community understand.
I think they're saying after it gets to the board, after we vote on it, there's nobody above us to say, go ahead, that we are the final step in the process. I think that's pretty much how it's worded, not final forever and ever, amen, but final for today, because there's nowhere else to go. The board's the tip of the iceberg, so.
I'm
there's nowhere else
making
to go.
notes, so I hear what you're saying. I will chew on it and everything else.
Okay, Angela.
To tie in what she was saying, I know some of the other districts have added into their reconsideration or their public or community, the other form, sorry, let me figure out the words here. The one that you said that you're looking to revamp, that's not part of 4.402 or 403.
4403.
It's the actual form that you fill out, and it says that that policy, once decided upon, I know other districts have, like, it can be what I think she's tying into is this cannot come back up for re-review for 3 months, 6 months, et cetera. Or to add the terminology per board session, you know, like, I guess every 2 years, because you guys rotate some seats every 2 years. So that being in there, or at least in that request for review of material policy, so that the public is aware and it's not just assumed based off of other dense policy that the public isn't quite as in tune with. So I think that was the notes that we were hoping would get taken. The other thing I had was to be sensitive to Mr. Kelman's request about like a hypothetical situation. Between, I guess, Jamie or yourself, in history of our school district, without, of course, giving detailed information, have we had a number of instances where there have been behavioral or liability issues in our district because of a book?
Liability, no.
Okay.
Behavior, I wouldn't know.
I'm just curious if we've had a history of that we could look at or dive into and see any patterns or anything along those lines.
Obviously, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
I'm not aware if that data exists. I think a lot of that's handled at the school level.
Okay, and that's curious if without, because I would think some of that might be under HIPAA or something like that might not be able to be shared, but I didn't know if that was collected.
It wouldn't be HIPAA.
Or
I mean,
mental health issues, I thought it might be.
And I think, I mean, I understand, I can come up with hypotheticals that would make great law school problems. I'm not aware of.
And I'm not saying there
incident,
aren't any. I was just curious if there were.
But I don't take this as a, well, it's never happened. I don't take your comment or your comment as it's never happened before, let's not worry about it.
Oh, yeah, no, that's, I don't want that to come
We
across
need to
that
be
way.
sensitive
Yep.
to the issue.
I don't want
So-
that to come across that way.
So I'll just add, in my career, I've taught multiple wonderful students who were dealing with mental health issues, and I'll just say that my hypothetical was very much not frivolous in putting it there. Not that you're implying that it is, but
Yeah,
just to,
I don't want
obviously
to
you
do that.
cannot go into details. But I definitely see it as a real concern that we have to at least think about. Thank you.
Okay.
Yep.
Go ahead, James.
Yeah, so the question I have is, in this policy or in this process, Is there anything that could maybe like trigger an equity look or a civil rights look when you all begin to realize like all of the books that are being challenged are like books by Black authors, Latino authors, LGBT authors, and themes? Does this allow for anyone to come in and address that issue as well?
So if I understand your question correctly, you're asking, I guess, what is the oversight for a school-by-school review? And the answer there is the Office of Civil Rights in Atlanta has jurisdiction to consider any issue. And so let's do a parallel. So several years ago, there was a question about whether the district was disproportionately suspending minority students relative to non-minority students. And if you think about it, the first thought would be, well, how would that be possible? Because you're looking at decisions made at schools that are separate and distinct, and they're not getting together to talk about the decision that they're making. Hey, here's what I'm going to do with this kid. What are you going to do with that kid? Right? So there's not any kind of conversation about this. And yet, one of the questions that the OCR might ask is there a systemic bias, right? And that's something that in districts literally around the country, the OCR has been equipped to ask questions about for decades. So I believe, to answer your question, I believe that if what we started to see was what looked like a systematic exclusion of authors on the basis of minority groups or some other, and the term we use is an invidious classification. There's an invidious classification, and we're only excluding authors who fit within a certain group. The OCR would have oversight to come in and ask the question, okay, have you created a Title IX issue? Have you created a Title VI issue? So that would be the mechanism.
Is there someone in the district who's like looking at that, or who would be,
I think they're just looking at the content of the book. I mean, who knows? I don't know what color these authors are. I haven't a clue. I don't know what their sexuality is. We're just looking at the content of the material in the books. So I don't know.
That wasn't my
I mean,
question.
nowhere is it
That-
written this author is black or this author is
That
Latino.
leads to the systemic issue. You might not know, but if the list continues to be populated by marginalized groups, then it's a
But if
systemic
it's just
issue.
done by the content, if it's just done by the content, and really don't even know who the author is, you're just doing by the content, then how?
And that's where I was going. And so the district's position would be, well, we can't speak to the trends, but let's look at the individual data. And so we would then look at the record, which gets us back to what I was talking about earlier. Okay, so let's take this book. All right, so this is written by a Latino author. Why was it excluded? And so you defend the merits of that decision. Well, then let's look at this one, and you defend the merits of that decision. And so conceptually, I can see how this would be an issue that the OCR might look at. I can see how that might happen, and then you'd have to defend the decision one at a time, and the defense would be, well, the committee.
Because I don't know who these authors are. I just don't know. And I specifically did not look because I don't want to be biased in any way about anything. I just wanted to read the material.
And so the defense, again, would be, well, okay, this violates our standard for what is offensive. We weighed it against these considerations, and we found it lacking. And here's something else to think about. The way that this is set up right now, you have the possibility where one school could say, we find that this does not violate our community standards, and so it's not removed. And another school could say, we find this very, very,
Is that
very
how it
different.
was set up? Because that wasn't how I picked it up as you explained it. Right.
It's so depending upon what we're talking about, whether it's a system-wide decision or if it's a school-based decision, you could get different results. And that's something that Jamie and I were talking about beforehand. Sometimes you're gonna have school-wide books, right? And they may not be appropriate for anybody. Sometimes, I'm sorry, school-wide, system-wide, sorry, system-wide. Other times it may be that the book only exists in one school because it was donated by, an alumnus. Or there was a community group. We're getting into the weeds of what ifs. I'm imagining a world in which one side of the county may say, this isn't, we don't want this in our school, but we're not gonna speak for you. If this book is valuable, we're not gonna, I can see room within the policy for that. We'll have to see.
I would not say that this is an in the weeds thing. It's a very in the moment thing, and it's talked about at multiple board meetings. So I think his question is right along with what is going on in the board meetings and in central office. I would not call that in the weeds.
What's going on in the board meetings and in the central office of NOS?
When you're talking about equity, it's talked about at multiple.
Like I say,
No, I'm
as
not
long
talking
as
about
we're,
books. I'm talking about one book for one school. I'm not talking, I understand
Well,
what you're saying.
his concept was not in the weeds. I think it was very appropriate.
And I wasn't trying to suggest he was in the weeds. I was saying I was getting in the weeds to try to talk about
he was getting in the weeds,
what
not
would,
him.
and sometimes one of my many flaws is I give more information when maybe I should give less. Because I'm trying to give people an understanding of the landscape. And it's a little hard to do with hypotheticals. But anyway, I hope that you're satisfied with the answer.
Okay, we're gonna start wrapping this up, so if you have any more thoughts, because we need to go on to 503 and let him explain a little bit about that. 504, where are we? 403. 403, yeah, 403. Okay, we're gonna let the ones that have their hands up now, and then I have one other thing that I want to say, and so go ahead and we'll just start with you right there.
Okay, I just wanted to talk about, or ask about a couple of words that are used in here just to get clarity on them. So when you were saying, Ms. Thurman was saying about the line where the personnel may not review, that was on 13 on the second page of 4.402, line 13, that said there might be sensitive content contained in these books that was not previously reviewed by school personnel. I think that there's some confusion about reviewed versus reading, because the school librarians are in fact reviewing, and they can tell you when they look up the professional reviews what the general concept of the book is. They can say why that they thought it would be good for the book. It's logistically, I don't want to say impossible, but I guess I would say very challenging for a librarian to be responsible for reading every book that comes into the library or that exists in the library. So if we're going to say reviewed versus reading, I want to say that the librarians are in fact reviewing, and as are the teachers. So we can just take this out because they're being reviewed then. So we can say, there are not any books that are not previously reviewed. So they've all been There could
previously
be legacy
renewed.
books, yes. They're like
So they've all been previously reviewed.
by somebody,
Okay,
not the
so we
current
can
librarian,
just take
perhaps.
this line out, so then somebody's responsible, correct? So there's not any, so it says there may be sensitive
I
content.
just wanted to be
containing
clear
these
that it-
books.
sorry.
So that there may be, so that whole line, they all have to be previously reviewed, and then so somebody's approved them already.
At some point in time, yes, somebody
Okay,
did.
so they're all approved,
So-
so that line is just not necessary.
I just wanted to get clarity about whether or not,
It's a CYA for the district.
Yeah.
That's up to you if you want to take that out.
but
That's what I say, I'm tired of CYA.
I-
I'm tired,
I
I want
just
some
wanted to be-
responsibility. That's what I want.
to be clear about the idea of reading versus reviewing, because it's just, unless there's going to be, 2 or 3 librarians at every elementary school to read them constantly, there's not going to be a way
Okay,
to do
well,
that.
nobody's saying anything about reading, it says reviewing.
Just
So,
wanted
like I
to
said,
be
but
clear.
you said they've been reviewed, so,
And my other question is about, on page 1, the line 27 on 4.402, that says the addition has been offensive to community standards. So I wanted to ask a question about how community is being defined, because the reconsideration policy, the committee review process that's in the school librarian handbook includes members of the community. And so that would be the community there at that one school, as you were saying, Mr. Bennett, that it would be a school by school, book by
It
book
could be.
process? It could be.
Could be.
So in the event that we're doing a, system-wide situation, like how would we be defining community? Like how do you define community as it's used in this? Because I think we've brought it up several times that we aren't necessarily 100%, representative of the community demographics, even just based on
Not even close.
age or race or income in this room. So, like, how would we define what community was?
So this committee is not intended to be, is not going to be making decisions on a book-by-book basis. So the committee that's set up in 4403, which I guess we'll get to in a minute, the review committee consists of the executive director, or the director of teaching and learning, president of the local PTA or PTO, principal of a county school serving the same grade level, and this is where we probably need an administrative procedure to spell this out, but my thought would be it should be the same learning community. And so those are the folks who are going to judge the work based upon contemporary community standards. And how do you define the community? It's where you live. And it's not intended to be something with a legal definition. It's really more commonsensical. So I think we can understand that if you live on one side of the county, you're going to have a different experience than someone living somewhere else, which is why we have different learning communities. So my suggestion to Jamie would be that when you're populating that, maybe the community superintendent appoints a principal from somewhere within that learning community.
So then this means then that it's always going to be a book by book, school by school situation, and not a system-wide.
I'm sorry, say that again?
When these books go under review, it will always be a book by book, school by school situation?
So the way this is written now, yes. Now, from a common sense perspective, sometimes there may be a challenge to a book that's part of the curriculum, and so you can't take it out of just one school. And so again, that was a conversation that Jamie and I had before we started. There's an administrative procedure from another district that bifurcates the consideration between school-based decision versus system-wide decision. Let's take, for instance, let's say there's a book that's part of the ELA curriculum, and the entire curriculum for a quarter is built around that book. Well, you can't very well take it out of just one school and you leave that school hanging, or maybe you can. I don't mean, again, hypotheticals are dangerous. But if it was the sort of thing where you were getting complaints in more than one area, at some point you need to have a system-wide review. And so I discussed with Jamie that there's a mechanism in place. We need to have a mechanism in place where we do the system-wide review. And I think you said that you sort of already thought through that, right?
A little bit. Right now, it's still at the school level, though. It originates at the building level.
Okay. So I've identified an administrative procedure from another district that I rather like, that allows us to have a system-wide review where necessary. But by and large, I think these need to be school-based decisions with school communities.
Thank you.
I was trying to find on my phone that request for reconsideration, but we'll get into that in a minute. Okay, Meg, go ahead. And then there's two people on this side, and then we need to wind it up.
Okay. This is going back quite a bit. We are decided we are looking at library books. Now,
Well, welcome to the committee.
however, we're looking at a policy that in rewriting or making suggestions on a policy that is not just library books. It's anything other than a textbook. So what falls under the instruction materials definition?
Are we back at
It's,
442?
yep, the title.
Okay, so anything other than a textbook that's used to support the curriculum, or rather the instruction, making it the instructional process, If you look, starting in lines 4 through 6, such materials could include, but are not limited to, books, magazines, newspapers, journals, and video, audio, God, I'm tired, and web resources. So it could be anything that's being used in the classroom by the teacher as a supplemental material. It could be a YouTube video. It could also be a library book, which is set forth on the second page, starting at line 9. So this policy really looks at literally everything except textbooks, including library material. But in this day and age, because we have access to so much digital media in the classroom, it's a recognition that we really kind of need to look at everything together through the same lens. And there have been some questions brought to our attention about outside videos being used by teachers and whether they were appropriate or not. So it seemed tone deaf in the moment to look at library books, but not also look at other materials.
I guess that is where I feel like our time and our resources have been limited. If we're making this and only having library books in mind, it seems like a lot of work when we're actually supposed to be looking at a policy recommendation for several different things.
I would think the same criteria would work for all of them. I mean, the same obscenity, the same, I would think, because it's really,
I agree.
library books is here, but should y'all use the same
And
criteria?
and Chromebooks as well.
Well, that's Chromebooks, Scott,
So that's a device. That's not something that's not necessarily an instructional material. So let's imagine. So well, it's a device. So let's imagine a teacher is teaching a class and wants to use a YouTube video, or a video from a third-party website. Well, that's not part of the curriculum per se, but it's being used to supplement instruction to make the class more interesting on a particular point. The same criteria apply here. What's the educational purpose? And that's defined by state standards. So if it's consistent with state standards, it's great. And if it's not, why exactly are you using it? And I can go on from there. So to me, I understand what you're saying. You're thinking library book, but our policy isn't designed exclusively around the library book. I think in the moment we've been concerned about library books because people have brought library books to the public's attention. But honestly, some of the questions that we hear, not at board meetings, is about this video or about that link. And is it appropriate to be used in connection with the curriculum?
Yeah, and y'all have heard I've been one of those voices, and I've expressed that my kids have, while in school doing work, have accidentally come across things that are inappropriate that the filters don't catch.
well, that's an IT problem.
Well,
That's
to me, it's a web resource. So our kids have Google Chromebooks, so they do Googling, and that's a web resource. And if we're going to make suggestions about policy, this feels bigger than the language we're using, and I would like a lot more consideration taken into that, because that is a very much larger problem.
It is, and it's a problem that we can't really get our arms around for a couple of reasons. One, there are further constitutional issues that implicate filtering the web, and there are federal statutes that implicate that as well. What we're talking about here isn't a child's access to the web while he or she is in school. What we're talking about here in the section above is where a teacher is using a YouTube video or a third-party website as part of the instruction, the classroom instruction, then it needs to comport with these standards.
What, it just doesn't say YouTube, it says web resources. And
I'm
I'm
using-
not the lawyer here, you
well,
are, but that does seem.
I'm using YouTube as an example.
Okay.
Because I'm not, because in this situation, I'm not speaking in hypotheticals. In this situation, I'm thinking of a very specific scenario where someone went to YouTube for instructional purposes, and maybe it wasn't the best choice.
Okay, my next question is a follow-up. So, Ms. Thurman, I think at the last meeting you've made mention, and I won't get the right verbiage, but I think you said kind of the board sets the policies and then an administration makes it
The administration implements it. Yes.
implements it, okay. So if the librarians read the policy and they build a leadership team that writes a handbook around that, and we only have 3 instances this year where that's been challenged and it's been taken care of, then it sounds like they're following the board policy pretty well. And I'm really having a hard time understanding what the problem is within our school communities.
Well, I think it's because a lot of parents did not know. They know now. They did not know. And a lot of parents had no idea there was a way to complain about the books in a form they had to fill out. They did not know.
Have
This
we,
is-
sorry.
They just did not know this. They know now. Because a lot of parents just trusted us as a board, and I'm the one who, ultimately, the board is the one who has to take the brunt of this. If there's ever a problem, it comes to the board. It doesn't come to the librarian. It doesn't come to the administration. It comes to the board. So therefore, this is why I'm very adamant that this gets fixed, because I do not want this to come to the board saying, why did you not know this? I want everybody to know this. And you say that there's a lot of these books in our libraries, and there are. And there's certainly no way that I can read them all. I mean, I have a full-time job as well. Plus being on the school board, a lot of parents are just exactly like me. They have 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 kids, and they can't go read all the books. They trust us. And I want them to be able to trust me, to know that we've done everything we can to make sure that they know what is going on in their school. So that's why this has to be fixed. This is our job. This is a school board job, and we've just asked the community help because it's just an overwhelming task, as you can see. Because at a school board meeting, if we discuss this at a school board meeting, we'd be there for hours. We're already there sometimes
And
3 and
have
4
been.
hours, and have been there. Absolutely, we've been there till early
then-
morning one time.
I have a,
But anyway, but they trust us. And so the way I see it, they have reason not to trust us at this point, because some of these books have made it into the library for their kids to get their hands on, and they had no idea they were there. And so I want somebody to be accountable. And so far, like I say, everybody's like, well, we're following the policy. Well, we thought we had a policy in place to keep some of this stuff out of our libraries. And obviously, either someone was misinterpreting the policy, we're just trying to clarify it, make sure that everybody understands. And we want the public to know that they can trust this board. When these books are put on our library, in our libraries, that they can trust us to have done our due diligence to vet these books before they get there, instead of everybody saying, well, we followed the policy. Well, obviously, the policy weren't, or some of these books would not have been in our libraries.
Okay.
If I may interject, because you said something and I want to comment on it. I think you're right. The policy as written is a pretty good policy. I don't think it has been very clearly understood, and I think it has lacked what I will call the balancing test for people to know that there's maybe an avenue to object to a book that might be offensive. So I think a large measure of what we need to do going forward is to push some of these complaints to the school community, let the complaints work their way through the system, because the board is ill-equipped to have, a book club meeting once a month and go through, is this or is this not a good book? Some of the things that have been read to us have been very painful to sit and hear. But we can't judge the work as a whole in the moment while we're sitting there. If you understood contemporary language from Shakespeare, some of that work is a little bit difficult. No one questions the value of Shakespeare. So that's where there needs to be a process where the works are vetted, there's a record that's developed, And quite frankly, what the board needs to do, and you'll see this in 4403, which I really hope we get to soon, is what you'll see in there is complaints about these books and other materials, whether it's a YouTube video or a website. Those get pushed now to the committee, and those get vetted there by the people who understand, maybe it's the curriculum, or maybe who understand the pedagogy, or maybe understand. And then it comes to the board on the record. So.
I have a question about that. So, Ms. Thurman, you said that a lot of people now know. Parents are waking up, they know. And we've been meeting for a little over a month, I think. Have we seen a humongous influx in people making complaints?
You know,
Mr.
no, I
Pierce?
don't know. I have no idea. I'm not on that committee. I didn't know that the other request for reconsideration had been filed until it was brought to me. We don't know that, so I have no way of knowing. I have no idea. So if they have, it's really immaterial to me. The fact of the matter is, I'm on the board, I'm accountable, and I want everybody else that underneath me, the superintendent and the people that work for him, to be accountable as well. Somebody has to be accountable, which was David's point all along. Somebody needs to be accountable, because I'm ultimately going to be accountable for people under me not doing what the policy says, and I want to know what why this is happening.
I think
So it doesn't make any difference whether it's 1 or whether it's 10.
I think it
Or whether it's
does.
100. No, it doesn't. We need to fix this policy.
It makes a difference to me.
It makes a difference to me as well. Dr. Pierce, have you seen
So
a
if we have
huge
no
influx?
complaints, we don't need to fix the policy?
If it's not broken, what are we fixing?
Oh, well, you
Dr.
could-
Dr.
I
Pierce,
would be
have you
curious
seen
to
a
hear
huge
from
Dr.
influx?
I have
Okay.
not personally received.
Okay, do we know if there, does anyone know if we've seen a huge, like, we keep hearing that we need to fix it, but no one has shown me how it's broken.
Well,
So-
just, I think
so
reading the
I
books.
can answer that question. Constitutionally, you don't have a measure for what's offensive. So constitutionally, the way the policy is currently drafted, for you to exclude a book would be kind of arbitrary. There's no standard in the current policy. So is the policy broken? Well, sort of back at you delegation, by what standard would someone decide this book is not appropriate for elementary students?
I can answer that.
Where in the policy does it say?
Okay, so like Mrs. Thurman said, they make policy and then staff implements it. And it's surprising to me that y'all have not read the handbook, because they have multiple levels of vetting a book.
Has the handbook read the policy?
Yes,
Okay,
it
then
quotes
how
it,
did
it's
these
built
books
around
get
it.
approved? I just don't
Well,
understand this.
Okay, so
You might not understand why it's approved, but only 3 people have had a problem, and now that they know, we have not
No,
seen a huge
there's a lot of
influx.
people that have a problem, they just haven't
People
filled
all
out the
over
form.
America are on.
Okay,
all over
okay,
the
let's start. We're
internet.
not gonna go there. We know it's a problem because it's a problem all over America. So right now, we're working on policy, and if you don't wanna work on fixing the policy, you think it's not broken, you know, you don't have to approve. I'm the one who has to vote on it. Some of the school boards have to vote on it. So you've given your ideas about what you think needs to be changed or not changed, and that's fine. That's why we're all here. And it will be up to the board to make the decision whether the policy needs to be changed. It's really not this committee's problem. But I was sent here by by the chair to get a committee together to give some options and some suggestions, and that's what I'm going to do. So you've given your suggestions, or if you have any more
Well, it's
suggestions.
changed now that we've gotten some new information tonight. I mean, it changes, because now we have, it's changed, because we have new information to look at tonight. I would like,
What new information?
well, Scott's new recommendations, the
Well,
letters in red.
Well, Scott compiled all of our suggestions that we sent to him and came up with this policy.
Without Mr. Bennett present before, and this is just for my own personal opinion, being clear that you were gonna take it and compile one document out of all of our recommendations was not how I took it. When you said, Ms. Thurman, that we would all put forth recommendations and they would all go to the board.
And they're all gonna go to the board. This is just Scott's,
Okay.
this is Scott's.
That was just a missing piece of that piece of information.
Well, what did you think we were gonna do? Have a policy that was 10 miles long?
Well, I asked, and
I
you did
mean,
not respond. I asked what was going to happen with our recommendations, and you
They're
did not
gonna go to
respond.
well, they're going to the board,
So this
Meg.
whole document is
And it's
going-
also going to Scott to give us some recommendations that we're going to look at tonight, and we were not told that, and that's what Angela is saying.
You've been
We were
asking
not
for the
told.
attorney to be here, and he is here.
Yes, but you
Give
also,
his recommend,
Yeah.
to look at your recommendations to make a policy. Obviously, you've never, Kathy, have worked on policy. This is the way it works. You give recommendations.
she worked on
Everybody
policy
does-
as a school board member, not as a community member.
And
That's
it-
different.
And that's why I have a problem with us doing policy. It should be.
We're
in
not
the-
doing policy. Scott
Well,
did the
you just
policy.
said
We
we
were
were.
given recommendations,
So,
like we always did, Kathy. You did, you were on the policy committee.
Exactly.
That's right. The board didn't write the policy. They came to us. You sent them to Scott, and we approved them. Same exact
But
thing.
we don't get recommendations from a group of citizens to go into
Well, we
the
should
policy.
get, well, all policies should be for the citizens.
Well,
I
if
think we
you'll,
thought our recommendations would have went to the school board.
They are.
They're gonna go.
I understand,
are.
can I finish? I think the miscommunication is that this would have gone from point A to point B, then the board would have digested and came back to you.
You know what the
to
board
write
would have
new
done? They'd have
policy.
said, Scott, here are the recommendations. Will you do us a policy?
Okay, and maybe so,
That's
but
the
that
way
wa-
it works.
Okay, so none of us are on the school board, and we don't know that type of question, so that's where I'd say it's very frustrating for a lot of us to not know all of those pieces of information. You're assuming that we all know your day-to-day operations that aren't public, that aren't processed, and unless we've served on any of these boards, we don't know your methods. So I think that's just saying that there is a piece of frustration, because maybe we needed to be talked step by step through that process, and instead of an assumption.
So I think the comments that y'all have been making all along, and your concern, that what you value in terms of what the policy should reflect, access to information, what does it mean to say community standards? These are all considerations that have resonated with me as I have been listening to what y'all have had to say. And I'm kind of bound more by what the Supreme Court has said. So I'm mindful of your concerns as a committee. I'm also mindful of what I've heard at board meetings from parents. I myself am a parent. And I'm mindful of what the board members think. And so my job really is to give the board a policy that allows them to reflect community values. That's my job. And so to a point that you raised earlier, Ms. Day, I think that the policy is good. I've tweaked it to provide what I would call some constitutionally defensible standards. You're right. I haven't incorporated the library handbook, but there's nothing in 4402 that references the library handbook, at least that I've seen.
Right, but
And so my point there is, why are we here? I think that the current policy needs to reflect what standards someone might use to say, you know what, this book is either not appropriate for elementary aged kids, may not be appropriate for high school aged kids, or maybe we restrict it. There's nothing in the policy right now that provides anybody with any clear guidance. And so you're referencing the library handbook. It's not come that hasn't come from the board.
right.
And so we need a policy-based yardstick that empowers the administration to use its discretion. That's what I'm saying.
I guess what the problem with one policy that lays that out is it doesn't take into account the different libraries that we have and who they service. So my son is at a middle school, and he's going in where there are high school books. And so what do we do with that? Because we can't have two separate libraries at this school, and we can't have two different ways of, one way to do it. So the librarians see, okay, we know it needs to be age appropriate, and we have different ways of leveling this up without putting grade levels on it. They have different ways to do that, and they explain to me why they don't want to do grade level labels, because some kids don't read on grade level and don't want to be seen reading lower below. So they've done the work, and it's happening, and the policy allows for the librarians to use their professionalism and their code of conduct to implement this, and I want to say they're implementing it well, and they do have to vet books. I sat with a librarian, and she showed me how she had one library book that she had to put into the system, and it took quite a while, and it went through many steps of appropriateness, how it would be categorized, and then put into the card catalog. I don't know if that's really how you say it anymore, but that's what I remember. But it's working. Some people might not like how it works, but as a community, we've only had 3 instances. And I know parents now know, but we're not seeing a huge influx of situations come up.
Okay, the fact of the matter is, we're gonna come up with a new policy on the school board, so that's a moot point. Anybody else?
It's
You want
not a
to
moot
move on?
point to me.
Okay, well, it is for this committee. Go
When
ahead.
you write, sensitive, you changed it sensitive to offensive, so you're gonna have to change that everywhere in the policy, right?
Possibly, I saw that, I left it in there further down because I think, so if you look at the second page, was line 12, however, there may be sensitive content contained in these books. Sensitive, to me, is a broader term than offensive. Offensive is a narrow range of things that we're gonna look at maybe removing, but maybe not. Sensitive doesn't meet the standard for being offensive necessarily. So maybe something that it's a sensitive topic. Maybe it deals with teenage pregnancy. Maybe it deals with equity issues. Maybe it deals with war. Those are all sensitive issues, and so in this towards the bottom of this, there may be sensitive content contained in these books. That's sort of an admonition to parents. You know, we're going to try to keep the offensive stuff out, but you know what? There may be something sensitive. And even as I articulated it verbally, I realized that I maybe need to find a different way to word it. But there I'm trying to capture a different thought. That you know, the library is going to contain lots of ideas, and we don't screen out ideas that we may disagree with necessarily. Does that make sense?
Yes, now, so when you're trying to screen out books, you're gonna be sensitive to other people's cultures and beliefs also, right? Does it allow, the policy allow for that?
Well, we're not going to screen out, a committee is not supposed to be screening out things that are short of the offensive standard, okay? So someone's cultural beliefs, religious beliefs, whatever, so someone may find a particular group's religious beliefs offensive. Well, so if it doesn't meet the criteria that we've set out here about profane language, graphic depictions of violence or sex, etc., or the like, things of that similar nature, then it's not offensive within the meaning of this policy. You may disagree with the ideas contained in there, but that doesn't mean that it comes out. So I'll give a for instance. There's been much discussion about critical race theory and whether we teach it, whether we don't teach it. Whether books that advocate critical race theory, whether they should be in the curriculum or not, is decided by the General Assembly. They're not there. Whether they should be used as instructional materials, General Assembly's decided that. They can't be. Could you have a book that advocates critical race theory in the library, or would that be in violation of this policy? That wouldn't be in violation of this policy because it's not offensive on the basis of profane language or graphic depictions of violence or sex. It's a different political idea. And you know, likewise, if you had a book, maybe this would obviously be in high school, about supply side economics. Now I'm really telling my age. Someone may disagree with that, but we don't screen ideas, right? This policy cannot be used to screen out an idea. It targets offensive content, and offensive here is kind of narrow. Profane language, graphic depictions of violence or sex, or the like. And I say or the like because
But
my
that-
mind doesn't let me go to everything that there's there.
But the language, like, what is, some cultures it might be, you know, offensive in some cultures and not in others, so who decides?
So that's, if I understand what you're saying, our friends in a nearby district had this very debate. Is some profanity over the line? Is it beyond the pale? And they said yes. And you know, some profanity is a step too far. Where's the line here? That will be up for a review committee. It will be up for, you know, looking at the work. Is some profanity, you're asking me where the line is? I don't know. I can't tell you. I can't tell you.
Okay, you want Scott, are we ready to move on then to 40?
Question, I have a
Okay.
question.
Okay.
I think, how many librarians are in here tonight? Have you all been asked to give your input into any of this discussion?
Other than Nicole, who's on the committee, she can't be here tonight, but she is on the committee. Other than
To
that-
me, that's who we need to be talking to is our librarians. Whenever we did, whenever we reviewed policy, when I was on the school board, if it had to do with HR, we dealt with HR. If it had to do with library, we should ask the input of the librarians. And I
But this
think
is
that-
not just about librarians, Kathy. We have somebody from the administration right here that is representing the librarians. That's why he's here. This is why, then this is also about the public input. This is not just about librarians. Obviously, librarians thought some of
About
the
the books
things.
in the
Yeah,
library.
that's right. Well, we know how the books, this is why we called Jamie in to get him to tell us the process for the books getting in the library. So that's the main thing we needed to
But
know.
what I'm saying is that we could ask our librarians that question, and they could.
Well,
probably
why
tell.
ask all the this is why he's
It may
their
be
representative.
different
Like
in
I'm
some
representing the
schools.
school board on this committee, he's representing the librarians. And that's why he was here for us to ask questions. And this is more about how the books got into the library and the content of the books. And so, and this is
Because
why
they
we're
brought
asking the
in a
community,
few
this is the community schools. These are not my schools, these are not Jamie's schools, these are not the librarian schools. These schools belong to the taxpayers of this county and the parents. We wanted their input and how they felt about some of the books in their library, what they found offensive. And
But it
that's
was
why
brought
this
to
committee's
us like
here.
one certain group of people.
No, it was not. No, it absolutely was not, Kathy. It is all over this country. I don't know if you're paying attention or not. It is from
We're talking
California to
about
New
Hamilton
York to
County.
The three-
Texas.
the three
Okay,
complaints from
okay.
one group of
The fact of the
people.
matter is we're here, and if those of you that don't think it's necessary, then you don't have to have any more input. If your job here is done, your job here is
No, I'm
done.
staying.
That's fine. And so, do what?
I'm staying.
Okay, that's fine, you can.
Okay.
Okay, but if you think this is frivolous and that there's no need for this, then it's up to the board. There's 8 other board members for now that are gonna be deciding this, not just me. So if you don't want to have any more say, then that's fine. If you think your work here is done, that's fine. But right now, we're gonna move on to 4403.
So let me, in the interest of time, let me just dive into the meat of the policy. If you look at the second page, so one of, and I understand what has been said at this point, that we've only had 3 complaints, only 3 complaints. We don't know that. We know that there have been 3 complaints that have gone through the formal process, or at least the start of the formal process. We don't know how many people have gone straight to the board because, quite frankly, that's, as Ms. Thurman's pointed out, the board is a final decision maker. And for whatever reason, people have felt like that's where they need to go. I don't know if they haven't been aware of the policy. I don't know if they attempted the policy and I don't know. What I do know is, literally for hours, we've been listening to complaints about content that should be better directed to review committees so that, if necessary, the board can then make an informed decision down the road after after the work's been vetted. And so the first thing that you'll see at the very, very top of this policy is, notwithstanding any other board policy, no one will be allowed to address the board regarding the content of any book or other instructional material until the procedures of this policy have been exhausted. I don't know necessarily that the majority of the board will agree with that, but to me, it's good housekeeping, because when someone complains to the board about a work, the board is ill-equipped in that moment to decide the value of a book that they haven't read. And so, you know, at the end of their 5 minutes, the most someone can do is say, well, how do you, let me get through this first. The most that someone can do is get to the other side of the 5 minutes and say, well, have you talked to your principal? Well, no, I didn't know I needed to do that. And that hasn't been the dialogue, but my point here is there's a process, and I think that some of the work that the board can do in this process is to push these complaints down to the administration so that they are handled appropriately. It may be that someone doesn't really have a problem with the book, they have a problem with maybe a comment that the teacher said. I don't know. My point is, there's a process. We should honor the process.
Okay, but one of the problems I have with this, Scott, is like some of the books that were in, that people filed papers about, they said they stopped, and I don't know if this was true or not, that the process was stopped when it came to the board. Was I told that incorrectly?
I actually think you're right.
That it was stopped. Okay, I don't like that. Why was it stopped?
I don't know.
I don't know that.
I don't know about that. I can say D, though, says the current policy says that if it bypasses the local school, it is sent back to that. So if you look at D, for instance.
Okay, well, this is what I'm saying. So it was stopped, so they say that there haven't been but this many complaints about books. I think you should be able to come to the board about anything, Scott. I'm sorry, I disagree with that, because if this had not been brought directly to the school board members, we would not have known, because by the time it went through this process, and then they said, well, we were following the policy, and the policy said we could have these books in there, then it's over.
And I
Then
think,
it's over.
so
And then it would have never made it to the board at that particular time, and we would have never been made aware of this. So I'm gonna tell you, in my district, if you're in District 1, you can come to me about anything.
Sure.
And
this is
we
not
will get through
intended-
this.
This isn't intended to say you can't go to a board member. I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
they're your elected representatives. You can
Right.
go to them about anything concerning the operation of the school. This is more, if you're going to sit there, if you're going to address the board and read the content of a book, I think it's fair to ask the question, have you read this to the principal?
Well, in some cases, Scott, it seems the librarians haven't read the book,
And
because they said they haven't read any of the book. Sometimes they say they haven't read the book
we
either.
won't know
Okay.
unless we push that back to the
Okay.
school to find out and answer that question.
But I'll also say again, I hate to keep coming back to the library handbook, but there's criteria they use to look at those reviews of those books, right? So they were not randomly selected.
Right.
Can I also say, I think part of this board policy, if you look at C3, right, is to bring it at the school level. So the first really approach on 4.403 C3,
Oh, okay.
really, the initial process of this is trying to work it out at the school level,
Yeah, I
right?
agree.
So you want it to be as close to the situation as you can before it reaches the board. right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Well, I understand that, but like I say, if had it not come to the board first, we wouldn't be having this discussion.
And I found.
We need those discussions happening at the school level
I
first.
agree. So I think that one of the reasons that we have gotten where we are is a little bit of bad housekeeping. I think that there was a school-based complaint about something, and, but likewise, someone wanted to address the board under our appearance for the board policy, which you have the right to do. And so, whether it was a good decision or a bad decision, but I think the previous administration decided, well, okay, now that the board has this, we're gonna cut this off, and we're not gonna handle it at the school level anymore. And I think that kind of became precedent. And what I'm trying to do is fix that, because I think that those decisions do need to be pushed. And to Rhonda's point, to Ms. Thurman's point, we do need input from the librarians about something, because I promise you, I will ask y'all, just let me get through it, I promise. We do need the input, and this policy presupposes that there's been a school level vetting, and for the last several months, there just hasn't been. We've kind of pre-terminated the process. It's kind of our fault, but it's also in keeping with the rest of board policy, where people can come to the board about virtually everything. And the question that I think we the board need to ask, you, the board, need to ask, is if it's being addressed for the first time in a board meeting, is that the best place to hear it? So this policy tries to get back in front of this and say, have you talked to your school? And if they haven't, then they can come to the board. They can always come to you. You know,
Yeah.
they call you at the.
They'll say, I'm the one who had
Yeah,
got
they
elected,
call
so
you
yeah,
at
they can come to me.
they call you at work, and you
Yeah.
light them up and say, have you talked to your principal? And if they have, then by gosh, and then the next thing you're going to tell them you need to talk to. Anyway, that's my suggestion, and the board may not agree.
Well, I think some parents are so appalled when they saw some of the stuff that they said, did you know this is in your library, without going and saying, excuse me, I'd like to talk to you about this library book. That's usually not when you're appalled, that's usually not your first reaction.
Sure.
You want to,
It's still on page
But
2.
anyway,
If you look
okay.
at line 11, number 5, and this is to your point, sir, I've circled this. Keep challenge materials available for use and review during the reconsideration process. I've highlighted that because I think maybe we should put something in there about the principal has discretion, rather than just saying absolute. I mean, I think the presumption is we don't take something out if it was appropriately included. But I hear what you're saying, and so I'll think about a way to tip the hat to. There may be an extraordinary circumstance where maybe a book somehow gets in, and we I'm like, oh my goodness, reasonable minds can't disagree. This book needs to come out. So I mean, I think that absolute language we need to address. Moving down to what were lines 19 and 20, I've taken out the board member and HCEA representative simply because I think that part of the review process, it really does need to be at the school level. And also I think if the board is going to conduct in my opinion, the board may disagree, and it's totally up to the board. I think if the board is going to conduct an independent review, it's better for the board to be outside of those conversations. Those are my 2 cents. Now I know, Rhonda, if they call you, you're going to be part of the conversations, and you have that,
Always.
and that's that's how you view your ethical obligation, and I
Yeah.
think that's right. HCEA representative,
but then too, the HCA doesn't really represent the teachers anymore either.
That's
so-
exactly right.
So that, they need to be gone.
yeah. Further down under what is now 7, or I've revised 7B, it's a nod of the cap to there has to be a yardstick that is used to measure the value of the material. And so they consider the materials in light of the criteria set forth in Board Policy 4402, criteria for review of materials. And I'll change the title of that to reflect some of the comments that we've had this evening. Let's see, and then what is now 30, I guess. And this is one of these areas where Jamie and I are going to talk about administrative procedures. I think that we're going to, if there's a review committee that has a hearing on this, there needs to be a good process, minutes taken. I mean, maybe not like prior written notice minutes, but good minutes taken. And so my thought is, if someone is dissatisfied from what the review committee does, it comes to the board. And so the board can either review the record and sustain the review committee. Review committee made a good decision, we sustain it. Or if you think, you know what, maybe the review committee didn't make a good decision. Maybe they shouldn't have taken the book out. Or maybe they should have taken the book out. The board can vote to grant a new hearing. But you can't just overrule the review committee without having a hearing.
Okay, a hearing like the hearings we have, the board have a hearing or send it back to the committee for another hearing?
Well, I guess we could even send it back. We could even do that.
Well, I mean, is that what you're saying about?
What I
the
intended
review
was-
committee shall-
What I intended here was there would be a hearing on the book.
A hearing with the board?
Yeah.
Just like we have here, okay, okay, hearing and send
Yeah,
it back.
and so
okay.
it would be like, Ms. Day, you brought forth some concerns about this work.
Mhm.
You have the floor, and so, you've got 15 minutes to tell us your concerns.
Okay.
And so
Just
then,
like we have a hearing, okay.
and so then maybe you ask, someone who wants to defend, yeah,
Yeah.
and then there's deliberation.
Can I ask a question about that? About that hearing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so going back to the review process, I agree it needs to be at the school level, because if you've got a great principal, in my opinion, you've got a great school.
Yep.
But in this situation that has come up since whatever, June, July, some people in the community do not have students in the school system, but they are concerned about the material in the schools because they're taxpayers. So if the review has to go through the school first, is that going to be open to the public, or does the parent, because I do have a child that I have custody of in a school, so I could go through the library, search all these books, and I could do that tomorrow. But what if my next door neighbor who's concerned about community standards wants to look on the library search engine and find pornography? I don't know. I mean, what is her mechanism?
So you're asking what standing does someone who lives in the community but is otherwise not connected to the public schools?
Correct.
What stand? So under this policy, they wouldn't have any, because they may not like it, but they're not affected by it. They're taxpayers, but generally speaking, just being a taxpayer doesn't give someone standing to challenge something that's this specific.
Okay, Angela,
I was
was it you?
kind of to the point of what she brought up when you were talking about it came before the board, they should probably recommend that they go through the policy process. I think, a question I had asked early at one of our other meetings to, Jamie, Dr. Paris, was that the requests that were filed this year were not filed by parents of students. So it stopped that process there. And then, some of those folks came before the board. And so that's kind of how a lot of, that's not all, or I'm not speaking for how Rhonda collected her information, but that's how some of.
I told you.
Okay, I just said that wasn't how all of it.
No, you said, I'm not sure how I collected that. I said, I told you how.
She said, I'm not talking about how
With that. Okay.
But that was a question I had asked was, like, why didn't that process carry on? And it wasn't, at that point, wasn't the board that jumped on at that time. But it was that there was no more process for what office is that, Dr. Paris? I'm not sure exactly who handles that, but they couldn't carry it any further because a principal hadn't submitted it. It wasn't brought forth through the school, so the process kind of stopped. And so that was my question. I think she kind of answered it was, if they go to the board and then they kick them back out, what was their next step? If it's not coming through librarian, principal, upscale. But I think you were asking something earlier as to you didn't know what happened to the few that had come into review. They had been, and he could attest to that they were submitted by people that weren't parents of students in our district.
Yeah, but there've
So they
been
didn't
other
move forward.
things. I think Scott knows some of the ones that were stopped by the previous administration. I think that's what he was talking about, that some things were, when it came to the board, they immediately stopped. It's not just those things. There were other things as well.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you were next.
Okay, so you have the book and it goes through the process, and so they say, well, we're gonna keep this book, even though people are appalled by it or whatever. Are you gonna put like a statement out, like where other people or other schools can see why the book was kept, and stuff like that, so that the next person maybe isn't so appalled, that they get it? So is there gonna be any way to track like that, like why one was kept or why one was rejected?
So you're asking an administrative procedures question, but the policy envisions something like that. So now we go back to 4402. In the event the administration or the board determines that a work is offensive but nevertheless offers literary value, then steps will be taken to advise parents or guardians when their students have accessed any such material. And of course, we can change that to advise parents or guardians that such material is being used. I'll think about that. But, I'm sorry, I was looking at the wrong person. So yes, I think if we go through the process and so let's take a work, Huck Finn, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. There's some language in there that some people find very objectionable, but the way Mark Twain uses it is he's actually fighting for racial justice. And so we ask the question, okay, is this work, taken as a whole, of great literary value despite the offensive language? And so I think maybe in that scenario, particularly if someone was going to, if it were being used in the curriculum, there might be a note home. Be advised that The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn will be used as a supplemental material, blah, blah, blah. There is some language in this work that some people may find offensive. However, as a whole, this work is of great literary value and teaches the values of X, Y, and Z. That's sort of what I envision the administration would do to alert people.
But will there be a catalog of this event so that the next school doesn't have to, they can have, their points can be met, that everybody's on the same page?
I don't see why not, but that's an administrative question. Now, also be aware that the way this policy is drafted, you could have two schools that reach different conclusions based upon the input of the community. I think that would be infrequent, but it can happen. I mean, again, when we're talking about community, we don't live in complete isolation from one another. But we have to allow that Rock Point could reach one decision and Midtown could reach another on the same work. That's possible. And we have to respect that process. So the fact that Midtown reaches a decision isn't necessarily precedent for another learning community.
But there would be a written record of that decision and rationale that they could still look at.
Exactly.
Okay,
I
go ahead.
had a few questions. First question, so we're changing the review committee, so on line 12 in 4.403, from 5 people to 3 people.
That was a question of mine as well.
So now we just have the executive director or director of teaching and learning, which is basically Dr. Paris. So that's not a school level person. We have the president of the PTA or PTO, so that's, a parent representative, and then the principal of a county school serving the same grade level. So that's a different school than the complaint was made. So I don't see where there's very much local school input on this review committee, and I find that concerning.
Well, it would still be the same learning community as we had discussed. And we could just as easily add a couple more people to that. I mean, there's a reason we do first drafts.
Yeah.
Um,
We asked for our input, so that's some input.
And I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that I sort of kind of imagine, if you look above when a complaint is filed, the principal and the teacher will review the validity of. And so I sort of assume that they are being part of the process because.
Can you make that more explicit? I think that'd be
can.
helpful.
Yeah, I can. The fact that I assumed it doesn't mean that a principal implementing this is going to necessarily need to do that by default. So, yeah, I think certainly that they would be part of it. And, we could even include, well, I'll talk with Dr. Harris about maybe expanding that to include a little bit more representation. But one of the reasons that I think, and again, I was working from the existing policy. If you look at board member and HCEA rep, I don't know that HCEA rep is necessarily a great choice, because that person might be a science teacher or a math teacher. So when I took it out, I didn't readily think of a replacement. So thank you for your comment.
Yeah. The only other comment that I would add is you've said several times that you didn't feel like the policy as written had very clear guidelines. And that's why you wanted to tie it to the list, kind of the bullet points in 4.402.
Yes, ma'am.
But as I read it, I mean, there's pretty clear steps in 7, D, E, and F, or really A. So they read the material in its entirety. They determine the extent to which it supports the curriculum. They judge the material for its strengths, values, objectionable content. And then they present a decision in writing. So that's a pretty clear process to me. I don't know that we need to tie it to all these bullet points and kind of, we're bringing now a lot of other considerations into the mix, and especially the new bullet point 8 that you added, the extent to which it may be considered offensive to the community standards.
So one of the cases where the district was found to have censored content, all they did was what's listed here. And because they didn't have what's listed in the other policy, they were found to have violated the First Amendment. So I understand.
Is that a district court case?
No, it's Sixth Circuit.
Okay. Would you mind sharing that with the group?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Angela, we're gonna wrap it up right here.
Okay, tagging on what she said, the line right above it, B, with the president of PTO or PTA, could we have something in there that offers an alternative, because we do have schools that do not have a PTO or PTA, so that way we have an alternative line for those schools that are, like and how we would, my question is, how would you decide that parent representative?
So it has to be up to the principal, how would you know?
Would the principal appoint that person?
Yeah, I would say president of PTA, PTO, or other parent representative appointed by the principal.
Okay.
Okay. So I will submit a summary of our committee meetings to the school board on next Thursday. I will give them all the committee recommendations, along with Scott's work here after he works on it a little more.
Do we get to see that summary first?
Do what?
The summary that you're going to write for the board, do we get to see that first?
Well, no, the one that I'm gonna write and give, well, if I can get it together, if I'm like you, Meg, I wouldn't get it to you till the night before the board meeting, but I will try.
I was waiting on the response from your questions before I wrote that, so that's why I had to wait till last minute, because I never got them from you.
Well, actually, you're a little late, but that's okay, we'll talk about that later. But anyway, I will, get the report to you if I get it together. I will do my best to do that. I will work with Sherry. Sherry has a lot of the information, and wait till I hear back from Scott, and then I will submit my findings, and I will give it to the board, and then the board will take it from there.
Scott, can I clarify one thing on the it's staying on consideration?
Mm-hmm.
It's under review. The committee may find it was fine. Right, so I think that is that the intent of why it stays in circulation?
Right.
Because it's really being investigated, it's not been determined yet.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm curious, is this policy, like the policy that, Mr. Bennett, your final product, Rhonda, is it being presented at the meeting, the next school board meeting? So would it be included in the agenda that would be posted the Friday before?
When's the deadline?
It's already passed.
So I don't know.
And what you need to understand, she's not submitting a policy. She will be doing a report on the committee. That will not vote on a policy Thursday.
No.
He said that they possibly could earlier, so that was.
No, he said they could possibly,
Vote on a policy Thursday.
he said we could vote on a first reading on the, he didn't say it would be this,
Okay,
it
so
may
you
not
could-
be for 3 months
You
that
could
we
make the
vote.
motion to.
We
make
will
the
not be
first
voting
reading
on this
for a
policy.
right?
We
And
put-
I'm trying to understand
Okay,
the
guys,
process.
we present it to the board. The board may like the way it looks and say, you know, next board meeting, we'll vote on
Debates
it.
for a work session.
They may ask for a work session to talk about it.
May forward it to the policy.
They may forward it to the policy committee. I don't know. It's impossible to say when it will be voted on, but it will not be next Thursday.
Okay, thank you.
Is this committee
misunderstood.
disassembled now and our
Yes.
work is done?
Our work is done. Thank you. I thank everyone for your commitment. I appreciate it.